G'day guys and gal. The Imperium took a lot of L's before, during and after the Horus Heresy, many of which were self-inflicted. However, one of the greatest L's they've ever taken was the banning of Librarians after the Council of Nikea, removing an extremely powerful asset from the Loyalists, which also was one of the only reliable ways to safeguard against the Warp and Demons. Because of this ban, the start of the Horus Heresy was a bloodbath for the Loyalists, the traitors using demons, sorcery and all kinds of warp taint to annihilate them. Loyalists, who could have magically vaporized entire Traitor Legion squads or thrown up shields to block fire that would have killed dozens of their brothers, were simply gunned down now by mundane bullets because they couldn't use their powers anymore. It got so bad that most of the Loyalist Primarchs came to the same conclusion: the Edict of Nikea was retarded, and thus no longer valid. A conclusion the Emperor and Malkador also both came to. But what actually happened to each Legion's Librarians after the Edict? Some were imprisoned, others killed, many returned to the rank and file, or in some cases, allowed to continue their warp magic anyways. It's niche lore, but that doesn't mean it isn't interesting. Before we get started, the sale of the big magic giant and his honor guard continues. I realized I didn't actually take very clear footage of it in Monday's video. I kept talking about the detail, but then I just blueballed you guys with the renders, so here you go. Now, as expected, the big magical giant did sell out in the tabletop scale, with there being a handful of 75mm art scale left, as well as less than 5 112 scale left. The 112 scale is epic, as you can see. However, in case this is your first time seeing it, or you're having mad regrets for missing out, I'm adding another 20 tabletop scale big magical giants, and that's it. Those won't last long, so if you're watching this, it's time. As I've said before, this is a limited special launch that will never be brought back as part of a new partnership with 3D Art Guy, where I'll be picking his best and brightest models, perfecting their supports and scaling, and then offering the physical versions to you guys and gal. You can get the STLs of the big magical giant from 3D Art Guy's Patreon, which I'll link below, but these models are complex as hell, so if you aren't very good at printing, the physical version may be easier. The Space Egyptian Honor Guard are also still in stock, stunningly detailed warriors and war mechs, comparable to the Loyalist Centurions. They tower above normal Space Marines, as you gotta bring the big guns when it comes to protecting your liege. Link is below. These bad boys won't last long. Today we'll go over what each legion did to their Librarians after the Council of Nikea. We will then see if they changed their minds when the heresy kicked off. Let's get into it. Starting this off with the Dark Angels. Number 1, the line was never going to disobey or overrule the Emperor's edict unless in dire need, so the Dark Angel Librarians were forbidden from using their powers and they were returned to their rank and file squad mates. Due to their secretive nature, they still dabbled in the esoteric and forbidden, but no one was shooting lightning out of their dickhole anymore. That was until the line ship was attacked by demons during the heresy, and one of the Librarians on board was like, "Fuck this shit," and he cum-blasted the demons with his power. This led to the infamous scene where a hero of the Legion, a chaplain called Nemiel, demanded the Librarian be punished for breaking the edict and disobeying the Emperor. The line was like, "Sure, he will be punished, but like right now we kind of need the Librarians, dude. Those demons were fucking you guys up." But Nemiel wouldn't relent or obey the Lion's command to allow Librarians to use their powers again, so the Lion, in a fit of rage, punched off Nemiel's head. Ufta. For the rest of the heresy, and even beyond, the Dark Angels used their Librarians again because it was the smart thing to do. Funnily enough, the Emperor's children never actually used Librarians, as the touch of the warp was considered to be a flaw, not an advantage. It was like a handicap, whereas they used to believe that perfection was achieved through hard work, not having laser vision. So yeah, there was nothing to do with their Librarians post-Nikea, as they didn't have them. In saying that, sorcery did seep into the Legion and the latter parts of the heresy, but not as much compared to a lot of the other traitor legions. This actually puts them in a similar boat with the Iron Warriors. Not exactly Iron Within if you're shitting rainbows and throwing fireballs. Iron Warriors have used sorcery to make demon machines and shit in the current setting, but you very rarely, if ever, see an Iron Warrior using actual warp powers like a wizard. The White Scars had a very sophisticated and deep relationship with the warp. Their Librarians were called Stormseers, and they were very different to other Legion Librarians. Whereas a Legion like the Ultramarines used their Librarians for practical purposes, the White Scar Stormseers were like the keepers of the Legion's soul and lore, having deep-rooted history in Chagoris. Their warp powers were a part of them, and they actually nailed the balance between power and caution. The Stormseers were actually wildly powerful, maybe even more so than the Thousand Suns. But they never drank deep of their powers, they just dipped their toes in and took what was needed. When the edict went into effect, the White Scars didn't even consider obeying it, firstly because they knew how to handle the warp and its dangers, and secondly, they knew it was directed at the Thousand Suns and other legions who abused the warp powers. Chief Stormseer Yasugai said that removing a Stormseer's power would be like removing your eyes. It just wasn't an option for them. I fucking love the White Scars, man. Funnily enough, the Space Wolves, the anti-Psykers who hate the Thousand Suns, had the same philosophy as the White Scars. The lore has very much established that rune priests are Psykers, that's a fact, but because they type their warcraft in with the history and culture of Fenris and deliberately cap their own power, they are not at risk of warp danger. As such, they too ignored the edict, not because they wanted to disobey the Emperor, but because they saw Librarians as other Legion's Psykers being allowed to just dabble in the warp willy-nilly, whereas rune priests were not Librarians, they were so much more than that. This could be seen as hypocritical, but the White Scars and Space Wolves had a deep history of the warp and were very protected from its dangers, whereas the other legions, like the Thousand Sons, were not. The Imperial Fists were an interesting one. Upon the edict being issued, all Imperial Fist Librarians were imprisoned on board the Phalanx, voluntarily. Some within the Imperium were outraged that Rogel was treating his Librarians like this, especially when the edict was rescinded by Malkador and the Emperor, but there was actually a method to the madness. Rogel wanted to keep his Librarians safe so he could use them as a secret weapon when they were needed. If he allowed them to return to normal duties, a lot of them would die before the Siege of Terra, but because they were kept in solitude, he had his entire Legion's complement available to him for the siege. A very Rogel Dawn way of thinking of things. The Night Lords did have Librarians and surprisingly did actually follow the Council of Nikea. However, when the heresy broke out, the Librarian Night Lords began using their powers again, some at the direction of Conrad for a specific task, but most because they felt like it and Conrad wasn't exactly the strict father. The Blood Angels followed the Edict of Nikea and ceased their use. However, during the Battle of Cygnus Prime, their Librarians broke the edict out of desperation to wake up Sanguinius and save the Legion. A number of them died in the attempt, but their efforts saved their father and their Legion's soul. However, it wouldn't be until a bit later on in the heresy that they're officially allowed to become Librarians again, once again out of necessity from all the demons and shit that needed to get clapped. The Iron Hands never had Librarians. It didn't really fit their vibe, which made them similar to the Iron Warriors in that respect. However, they did actually have Battle Psykers. From what I can tell, these Battle Psykers followed the edict. However, some of them began using their powers again during the heresy, but by this point, there was only a handful of them still alive. The World Eaters did have Librarians, surprisingly. However, Psykers were incompatible with the Butcher's nails. World Eater Librarians with the nails would be wildly unstable and would eventually explode as the nails were anathema to Psykers. This meant that the World Eater Librarians were some of the only sane World Eaters still in the Legion due to them no longer putting nails in Librarian brains. During Angron's unconsensual ascension to become a demon Primarch, the remaining World Eater Librarians attacked Lorgar to try stop him from ascending Angron. However, they weren't strong enough, and with a single blow, the newly ascended Angron killed the rest of the Librarians, leaving the Legion completely free of them. Ultramarines actually make for very impressive Librarians, with them having had some of the most powerful over the millennia and also quite a high amount. They followed the edict to a T. However, when the Wordbearers attacked and took many Ultramarine worlds by surprise, a lot of the Ultramarine Librarians came to the same conclusion. We need to use our powers to save our worlds. Hence many Ultramarines broke the Edict of Nikea in order to kill a fuckton of Wordbearers, often saving entire worlds in the process. After the initial shock of the heresy and the revelation of demons, Guilliman rescinded the Edict of Nikea and reinstated his Librarians, a very tactical move that would prove to be a great idea time and time again. The Death Guard's Librarius was disbanded when Mortarion took over his Legion due to his hatred of Psykers. However, when Morty started using his Psyker powers and Nurgle infected the Legion with warp aids, Death Guard sorcery became quite prevalent, so you could say that their Librarians were back in business. Many Thousand Sons were Psykers in some form or another, and they too ignored the Edict of Nikea, not in a cute way like the White Scars or the Space Wolves, but in a very destructive, careless way, literally proving the Emperor's point about why the Edict went into effect in the first place. Because of this, the Wolves were unleashed upon them and Prospero was destroyed, alongside 95% of the Thousand Sons, with the few survivors going even deeper into warp sorcery. The Lunar Wolves weren't really known for their Librarians, but they did have some. However, they were rarely ever used on the field as battle psychers, more so as researchers who would study enemies that used the warp as a weapon and uncover ways to combat it. I do believe that this research was halted after the Edict of Nikea, however when the heresy broke out, it was a bit of an open season, with a number becoming Chaos Sorcerers. The Wordbearers had quite a few Psykers and Librarians who did cease their powers after the Edict, however when the heresy broke out, many of them became Dark Apostles and Chaos Sorcerers, which, yeah, that checks out. The Salamanders had a small Librarius which they dissolved after the Edict, returning their Psykers to rank and file duty. The few surviving Salamander Librarians after the Dropside Massacre may or may not have returned to using their powers depending on what Shattered Legion warband they were attached to. The Raven Guard were an interesting one. They had a number of powerful Librarians as well as warriors like Nakonai Sharakin who could Wraith Slip, which was a warp-based ability. They ceased their Psyker powers after the Edict, however pretty much all of them resumed out of necessity after the Dropsite Massacre. Funnily enough though, although initially reinstating his Librarians, Corvus Corax had a bit of a midlife crisis us about the warp and then banned them again halfway through the heresy. Bit of a strange call, but fair enough. And finally, the Alpha Legion. They completely ignored the Edict of Nikea, as in their arrogance, they believed they knew better and were exempt to all rules, an attitude that ended with Alfarius getting his tits murdered off of him. All Librariuses were reinstated post-heresy, but with significant rules and restrictions placed on them to keep them safe, more or less following the example of the White Scars. What does all of this tell us? It tells us that the Edict of Nikea was actually pretty loose, and all the Emperor was saying was, Magnus, please don't fuck shit up. I'm so close to putting us in a golden age. Just don't be a fucking nerd for 5 minutes, okay? It wasn't about Librarians, it was about Magnus not using dark warp sorcery, which the big man just couldn't help himself with. Magnus did definitely do something wrong. If you enjoyed the video and you want to support the channel, then pick up the Big Magical Giant. As of right now, there's 20 32mm tabletop scale, 13 75mm art scale, and 5 112 scale left, so this is it. Join the Discord for more memes and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.